Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Today we are going to discuss cover cropping on limited acreage, and how about we also discuss some good alternatives to cover crops that are good for soil health where you don't have the space to grow a cover crop. They exist. So let's do it. So cover crops, real quick, what the heck are they? Cover crops are annual plants that we grow not with the intention of harvesting them, but with the intention of murdering them and then stealing their nutrients. What? Essentially, cover crops spend their lives photosynthesizing and feeding the soil life, who are themselves making nutrients available around the root zone. And so when those cover crops die and are left in place, the cash crops that go into that same space afterwards can take advantage of all the hard work of the cover crops. And in my experience, few things create a more robust crop response than when my cash crop follows a cover crop. However, there exists no shortage of ways to screw up cover cropping, and that is especially true on a small scale. For emphasis, this video alone will not be enough for you to know how to plant a cover crop successfully. Full stop. Gardening and farming are exceedingly nuanced and context specific, so I recommend watching our other videos on cover cropping. And if you do not already own the Living Soil Handbook, pick it up from no-tillgrowers.com to both support our work and get a deeper dive into cover crops and which ones to use and when. Now, let's talk about the context in which you should maybe not even bother growing a cover crop, because although few things will be better for your soil than cover crops, they don't make sense in every context. And there exists a lot of different ways to boost and maintain soil health without growing a cover crop. Okay, so an example of a context where cover crops might not make the most sense is very small gardens or potentially urban farms where the beds are already in production from early spring until late fall. If you don't have space or gaps in production, you may not have the space for cover crops. Basically, cover crops often overlap the growing season, like winter-killed cover crops, for instance. In order for crops you hope will die in the cold to put on a reasonable amount of above-ground biomass before that happens, here in Kentucky at least, I need to sow them by September 15th. They will be dead in the early spring, but the farm is still very much in production in September, so I have to take those beds out of production before I can sow the cover crop in most instances, to get the amount of growth I want on them before they freeze to death. And you can't plant a winter kill cover crop like field peas too late, which in our region would be October 15th or later, or it will more than likely survive the winter and have to be terminated in the spring. Simple rule of thumb here is that when cold hardy crops are small, they can survive the winter better than when they are tall. Didn't totally mean to rhyme there, but a sort of opposite example is rye and vetch. These are what we call winter hardy, meaning they can survive their winter. Rye and vetch can be planted later in the fall and even into the winter, but the earliest we can reliably kill them here without tillage is mid-May. So if I need those beds in March, it's not super convenient to have this massive grass there. Now, there are some ways to interplant cover crops into existing beds that I will touch on towards the end, but if you barely have enough room to grow what you want to grow, and you're growing from early spring until late fall, you probably don't have enough room for cover cropping, and you will have to find alternative ways to maintain good soil health. Good thing I have a list right here for how to do just that without cover crops. First, growing something, anything. Even if it's a cash crop that you plan to harvest, it's better than growing nothing at all. Fallow periods, even in the winter, can be highly detrimental to soil health. Like I said, plants feed the soil and the soil life. And as I am wont to say and wont to repeat, if the soil is not being fed, it is feeding on itself. So, for instance, in areas that are not covered in snow year-round, but still have reasonably cold winters, a spinach crop over the winter will both feed the soil and the farmer. In areas further south than us here in Kentucky, Zone 6B, 7A, you may also be able to get away with kale or collards all winter and then let them flower in the spring for another good crop of kale flowers. Or cilantro. That's another very winter hardy green that I like to throw into winter hardy mixes. There are others too, such as mosh, which is a really delicious and annoying to harvest winter green that chefs love. They love the annoying stuff. I've been working more and more on overwintering leeks in the field. I've even got a seed breeding experiment I'm working on to see if I can develop an outdoor hardy leek for my region. That way I can harvest those out in March and April before they bolt and then replant those beds to something else. Alliums can definitely serve that same purpose as Evan Chinder discussed in this recent video we did on overwintering alliums. Very cool stuff. Yes, you will take some nutrients with you when you harvest a crop, but so long as you are not then tilling the soil up and exposing all of those roots and nutrients and microbes to oxygen-loving bacteria who will gobble them up. In case it's not clear, what I'm describing here is what happens in a tillage event. Anyway, so long as you are not doing that and you are leaving the roots in the ground and the soil undisturbed as much as you can around the root zone, you are gaining soil health. Cover crops are better at it, certainly, but cash crops are a solid second option. Next, if the soil is going to be actively consuming whatever is in it and on it over the winter anyway, you may as well put something there you don't mind the soil eating up, such as a mulch layer. Compost or clean straw are good for that. Not only does a mulch protect the soil from erosion, but as the soil slowly decomposes, the compost mulch, to use that example, with compost mulch not only will you have a nice easy place to plant in the early spring, but the soil will be better for it. This is also a nice alternative in areas where cover crops are not an option over the winter because of extreme cold or heavy snowpack. If you don't have an organic mulch that you can trust, putting down some amount of good compost and covering that area with something like landscape fabric would make a reasonable alternative. For me, the preference should always be on photosynthesizing plants, but the reality is that crops or cover crops don't always make sense. So just do what you can. Again, as I've talked about on this channel many a times, the three main principles of soil health are keep the soil covered as much as possible, planted as much as possible, and undisturbed as much as possible. The as much as possible in each of those is the most important part. Don't beat yourself up if you can't cover crop or mulch everything. Just do as much as you can in your context and keep working towards better and better systems. I'm constantly trying new things and alternative options based on my context, and my farm is far from perfect. I mean, look at this place. It's like a farm and an amateur improv troupe had a baby that was then reared by a mad scientist. Okay, so that's the if you can't do cover crop section. And again, at the end, I will talk a bit about how to interplant cover crops into existing crops for those who feel like they can pull off some amount of cover cropping. But for the moment, let me give you some simple approaches to cover cropping on a small scale that could be done easily. First, if you plan to have a bed out of production within 3 to 4 weeks of your first fall frost, then a winter kill cover crop is an option. I like field peas on their own because although oats are often paired with field peas, they do not reliably winter kill for us. The oats don't. Keep in mind, field peas and Austrian winter peas are not the same. Austrian winter peas will survive the winter. Field peas will not, so long as you reliably get a few freezes in the winter. September 15th is a good number, but going too much earlier, you can actually just result in peas, which would be a weed in the spring. So, be conscious of that. But if you get it right and you get a good growth on it, they will terminate themselves. Well, the winter will terminate them, which is super convenient. Don't get too mixy with it, but you can incorporate some summer crops into your winter kill peas like sorghum, Sudan grass, corns, millet, and buckwheat if you want a little diversity. Whatever crops that you know will die fast, will grow fast and die in the winter is fair game for a winter kill cover crop. I just always tell people to not get too bonkers with their crop mixes, especially before you know how each one grows. To reiterate, winter killed cover crops are nice because the beds will be ready as soon as you need them in the spring. Winter hardy cover crops will not relinquish their hold on the bed quite as easily or quite as early, but if you do not need a bed until later in the spring or even summer, the further north you get, a winter hardy cover crop might be perfect. I like rye and vetch, but Austrian winter peas, mustards, and beets, yes, beets, crimson clover, winter wheat, and lacy phacelia can also be mixed in. Tillage radish is another good one. It's good for breaking up compaction. I like throwing in stuff like extra kales and arugulas where possible. Some of that may die and some of it will live, but if I'm going to terminate it anyway, as described in this video, then I'm not worried about what survives and what doesn't. Don't overthink this or overdo it. Keep your cover cropping simple, especially in the beginning. If your beds are in production late with things like carrots, but not in production that early, lacy phacelia and crimson clover is my favorite combination, if for no other reason than it makes the farm loud. And a farm that is loud, with the sounds of insects and birds, is a healthy farm. As for the summer, if you have a gap to fill, I like buckwheat because it flowers in 24 to 30 days and it can be killed with a mower more often than not. It's a nice placeholder between crops. Again, field peas are another good one for that, as are mung beans, which grow pretty fast. Mixing other crops with buckwheat, however, is generally not a great idea, though, because the buckwheat will go to seed before the other crop has really had a chance to grow. If you want to use buckwheat with other summer cover crops, sow the buckwheat 7 to 10 days after the first crop, so it won't outgrow them and shade them out and then go to seed like a punk. The thicker grains and grasses like sorghum Sudan grass do not die as easily either. Stay away from those unless you plan to have the winter cold help you, or you want to till them because they are hard to kill even with a tarp. Speaking of termination, though again, we have covered that in many videos, these days I simply like smashing the winter hardy cover crops down with my flail mower or power harrow and covering them with a tarp. That's the simplest, fastest, and most reliable way to do it. The farm is just Hannah and I this year, so I'm learning the extent to which I'm just a lazy farmer. So expect my tips to be profoundly simple for the remainder of the year. Whatever gets the job done is the Farmer Jesse Way 2024. Easy. Anyway, I can literally make hundreds of videos on the nuances of cover cropping and planting into cover crops and killing cover crops, and I probably will make those over time, but for now, you will have to do more research yourself before you start down this most fun and most photosynthetic path. I love cover crops, but again, they are not for everyone or every situation. Evaluate your context and needs and go from there. Oh, right. One thing I did want to get to before wrapping up this video is interplanting cover crops into existing crops. One example of this would be to sow crimson clover, just broadcast it into fall brassicas or radicchio or whatever crops you grow in the fall. For us here in zone 6B/7A, crimson clover does not winter kill, so you do have to deal with it in the spring. But the nice thing about all clovers is that they are so small, they germinate well without being worked too much into the soil. As long as there's moisture there, you can broadcast things like crimson clover onto the surface over top of the crops that are already planted there once those crops start to mature a bit, and then the cover crop typically germinates pretty well. For insurance, or if you have the space between crops, you can rake or cultivate those clovers in or sow them with a seeder. Seed to soil contact is really important with any crop. Cover crops are no exception. Another example of interplanting a cover crop is after you get your first cutting of lettuce off of a bed, of Salanova or some other cut and come again heads, sow a cover crop in between the rows of lettuces. And so by the time the second cutting comes out, the winter kill cover crop can take over. I mean, on a very small scale, you could even start the cover crops in trays and transplant them so that it has a bit of a head start, and then you don't have to worry about when that bed is free. For that, you would just need to start a few trays of cover crops the same way you would start any other crop and plant it relatively densely within each of the cells, and then plant it into the bed once that bed is done for the season. It would be a lot of work on my scale, but on, I don't know, like a 4x8 garden bed or something, it wouldn't take but 10 minutes or so to transplant it. Anyway, the last thing I'll remind you here is treat your cover crop like a cash crop. Good soil preparation, no weed pressure, all that stuff. Sowing a cover crop into poorly prepared soil will get you a poor cover crop on poorly prepared soil, which I assume is not the goal. Okay, if you like these videos or any of the videos that we do or any of the podcasts, consider picking up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook at no-tillgrowers.com or a hat or other merch. Buying it from us is how you support our work. Also consider joining our Patreon page at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers. Being a Patreon member enables you to help make decisions about what kind of stuff we create. Also, there are some new discount codes over there, which is also rad. Or just hit that super thanks button, that works too. So, super thanks for your support. We'll see you later. Bye.